Good morning, everybody. I will open today's meeting of Te Puna Kōrero on the 18th of July, 2024. Let's start with karakia all together. Whakatakita hau ki te uru, whakatakita kia mā taratara ki e hi aki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei, mauri ora.
Well done, Mel. Well done to New South Wales.
On apologies, I have apologies from councillors Ford, Leggett and Nalo, and I'll note an apology for lateness from Taku Parai. I'll also note the leave of absence from councillor Johnson, and finally that councillor Duncan is joining us by Zoom online. I will move those, seconded by councillor Philo. All those in favour? Opposed? That is carried. Public forum, we have no public forum today. I'll move straight through to conflicts of interest declarations. Are there any conflicts of interest? There do not appear to be any. Moving through to notification of extraordinary business. There are no items of extraordinary business, so confirmation of minutes for our 4 July 2024 meeting. I will move those. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Hayward, thank you very much. Are there any amendments to the minutes? There are none. I will put the minutes. All those in favour, please say aye. Opposed? That is carried. That brings us to item 7.1, the report on Sister City visit to Blacktown. I will move that to put it on the table. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Philo, thank you very much. Do we have any comment from these? Not initially from officers. Any questions from councillors? Councillor, we happy?
No, I just want to say thank you for the report. Yeah, it was a good read.
Cool, fantastic. No further comments or questions from councillors. I will put the motion that we received the report. All those in favour, please say aye. Opposed? That is carried. That brings us to item 7.2, proposed changes to the Development Contributions Policy 2024 to 54. I will move that to put it on the table. Do I have a seconder? Mayor Baker, do we have any initial comments on this or straight to questions? Straight to questions and comments. Councillor Hayward.
Ata Māori Matua Upoko Mehikai, Kanahita Katoa. Thank you to officers for preparing this material. This was covered under the workshop, but I think for the sake of fullness and transparency for those who are listening in, and hello all three of you, can you please kind of go through some commentary as to those options that council are working on with regards to meaningful support for the development of papakainga and social community housing that's not going to be covered through this DC proposed changes because this, as I said before, it was covered under the workshop, just want to be covered more fully here as well. Kia ora.
Through you, Chair. So at the start of the review of the 2024 policy, we looked at how the Te Tura Whenua Act 1993 preamble would actually affect or needed notified changes to the DC policy. So at that time we undertook a significant piece of work with an internal project team to actually look at kaumātua housing, papakainga housing, and more broadly actually how we could support social housing within the city. One of the first things that comes up through DC policy is ultimately it's underpinned by a growth pace for growth philosophy. So that's the fine balance that we needed to strike. So through the development of the policy, we worked internally with all aspects of councils and officers and reviewed all the currently available material that was nationally available. So Te Puna Kōrero released stuff around papakainga housing. What we effectively established is it was much bigger, or a much bigger question needed to be answered other than are DCs the limiter to social housing? So there's a much more holistic approach, and there is a project group that has been set up internally to actually deal with this and work directly with Ngāti Toa as a partner to understand this. So where we have landed in the DC policy itself is the introduction of kaumātua housing. This is more on an alignment basis. So in the previous policy, Council hadn't really been presented with development such as kaumātua housing, and it's really in alignment with the retirement village factors that already exist. So we are noting there is further work to be done, but it shouldn't be the DC policy that is the factor or the driver behind that. It's potentially something that needs to be considered or factored in, and other ones noted as rates. But the ultimate question that needs to be asked nationally as well is, what is the restricted to Māori land ownership? And is it actually the development end of it, or are there actual more social enterprises that could be engaged? So there is a project team that has been set up and is intending to report back to council within the next 6 months or so around a broader project and what that looks like. So in the future, the DC policy will likely pick this up at its next review, which would be at this stage proposed for 2027.
Thank you. And that's a very good response. Well done, Zach. With regards to the project team, is there discussion or is there limits on the discussion around retrospectivity? Because obviously we have existing social community, non-government social and community providers already in Porirua, and I'm just trying to get a sense of how deep the rabbit hole goes in terms of how we're going to, if we're not talking about DCs but talking about broader relief.
I can cover it through initially. So the reason this has probably gone more holistic is what we've done rather than trying to reinvent the wheel ourselves. There are actually national leaders in the space. So there has been a need actually to reach out and talk to those likes of Gisborne Council, Auckland, who have actually somewhat working models around this to look for development. So that was the need, is that to rein this in or actually specifically outline what we're trying to achieve is the question. The one around Māori land ownership under the Te Ture Whenua Act is actually quite defined in terms of the ongoing ownership. So that's where we've kind of got to. The need to more broaden it. That's probably my comment from a DC space. I don't know, Nick, if you've got any further comments there.
I can just say, Jeff, that we are working quite closely with Ngāti Toa to try to understand more and garner what are good practices across the country, as Zach said. So I guess this is do it once, do it right, and get as much information as we can. So that's the phase we're in. Jade is leading that project from my team. So happy to provide more information to councillors if you want to.
Just a quick request. Following on from that offer, Nick, and thank you for that, and Zach as well. It just would be useful just to keep for us certainty around the timeframes of this work as well. If there are shifts, just even highlighting that in the weekly update would be useful, just so we know that there is progress being made. And sometimes headwinds do come from time to time. No more questions. Kia ora.
Councillor Duncan.
Oh, yeah, thanks. I've got a couple of questions. I'm hoping they weren't covered in the workshop, but the first one, I'm impressed with the time, page 74, with the dates that you're actually going to be going publicly notifying it there. That's interesting. But my question is the money ring fenced for the areas that the DCs are being paid in?
Apologies noted, there was a correction, that's my mistake, so that will be corrected. Apologies on the first point. In terms of is the money ring fenced, is the question relating, could you expand on that question just to make sure I can answer that correctly?
So if the DC is being paid for an area because and the likelihood is that parks would be overloaded and playgrounds, etc., would that DC money be going into there or into a sort of consolidated fund for all parks?
Through your chair. Sorry, thank you for the clarification. So the parks or the new reserves portion of the DC policy is kind of the most robust part of the policy, and it looks at like a neighbourhood catchment or 400 houses. So the idea is that collection basis will look at it in terms of walkable catchments, and that's the kind of the language in industry. What we do is we collect it broken down by its separate catchments. So it is recorded in our internal systems of the catchments across the city. So there will be a broader plan around this, around how this is actually rolled out. And I know the parks team is looking to put together a spatial plan for the city in its entirety, and then how we actually get a desired level of service across the city itself. So the intention is, yes, what you should see over the long term or 30-year term, that every individual catchment will have the same level of service. So the idea is it is effectively ring-fenced per locality.
Right, thanks. One other question. Could you remind me about Kaingaora in DC's policy? Because I note in Titahi Bay they have plans for brownfield development there. Will they be charged DCs the same as other people?
Through you, Chair. The simple comment there is yes, they are. So there are provisions under the underlying LGA that There are restrictions who can be charged DCs. Typically, that's just ministry or government-related organisations. KO, because it's at arm's length in some ways, are charged DCs. So for any development they come in, they are assessed as any other development in terms of new households created.
Thanks very much.
Councillor Filo.
Could you, through the chair, could you expand on maybe an example of, say, in the Western area, what Councillor Duncan was just referring to there, where a park would be or a green space would be placed?
I can give you through you, Chair. It isn't my area of technical expertise, but we have worked with parks on this. I think I can provide the general comment. The idea, if you were starting Porirua from scratch, is you would look the idea of urban design and you would place it throughout the city as you go. What we find is in greenfield that is somewhat easier, hence we've always had the greenfield reserves catchment, because as developers come in, we can work with them around what that looks like, where parks should be placed, and the walkability of those catchments. With brownfield reserves, the reason this has been introduced is this has been direction from the National Policy Statement of Urban Development, i.e. brownfield intensification. So what this will likely look at is, this is kind of the first response we've had to understand what our level of service across the city looks like. In terms of brownfield catchments, you will permitted Porirua City Council is in a reasonably good position in existing brownfield catchments where we tend to actually have reasonably good supply of land. In terms of what we talk about in terms of brownfield reserves, what that likely will be isn't additional land or purchasing of land. It will probably look at the better activation of what land we have, better parks facilities and playgrounds, etc., etc. So it is something that needs to be worked through. So this is effectively a response of national policy direction, and that's the intention for parks, is rather than doing this as a catchment by catchment basis, we'll get a level of service across the city, and then we'll be able to evaluate each individual catchment, but then actually add neighbourhoods itself. Does that answer your question?
So if KO is building or developing in Western Porirua, and there would be, what I think what I'm hearing you say is whatever land we've got already there, we would invest in developing that more, or investing more in an already green space that we have. Is that what you're saying?
Through you, Chair. Essentially, yes. So what the Parks team will do is it will look at its underlying provisions. The metric we use in the policy is for every 400 homes, there should be a certain provision provided to each homeowner within that. So what they'll do is they'll look at the existing land. They'll work out whether there is sufficient land. If there isn't, we may look to acquire land or purchase, or work with a developer for pluses and minuses. The problem with brownfield is that becomes quite restrictive, because typically when you get brownfield development, it's in ones, twos or threes, or it's fragmented, as opposed to greenfield where you've got a lot. So it will be a process to work through. With Kaiang Order, what we do in the east is we actually look at the land holdings between both parties and where we can get those pluses and minuses and land transactions, but there is a full-fledged process behind that, which if you want the actual process for us that follows, you probably want to pose that question to a parks technical officer.
I was just trying to get a broad understanding of an example, but yeah, I
don't.
Yeah,
sorry, I don't think.
that's cool.
Yeah, I don't.
But just for clarity too, prior to this, brownfield and Kaumatua, they didn't have any. So brownfield wasn't included before, and Kaumatua housing, were they just considered what every other developer was? Is that the case?
Through you, Chair. So brownfield wasn't previously in the policy because council's kind of overriding position was we had sufficient land in brownfield catchments to service the existing communities.
Okay.
As a result of the national policy statement and intensity, we'll find a higher demand on our existing network. And as you get obviously ramped up density, you have smaller houses that the working example is if you want to have a barbecue and you live in an apartment, you can't do it in the apartment and you need to go somewhere. So it's changed the view of what we probably need to provide in those existing catchments. So it's in response. So that's why it's an introduction now, is this is the first time we've been able to update the policy since the national policy statement was introduced. In terms of kaumātua housing, this one's actually pretty simple. We hadn't had an instance of kaumātua housing, to my knowledge, and I've been talking about the last 5 years, in the city until that point. So this has come up through various discussions with Ngāti Tā and other providers. And had it come in historically, it may have been viewed under the existing retirement village provision anyway, because the definition there possibly would have provided for that. But what we didn't want to do is have it possibly provided for. So we wanted to make it quite explicit that was in there. And should anyone be looking at the initiative around kaumātua housing, there is a particular part of the policy which you can come and engage with us on. So it's more of a clarification and alignment. It's not to suggest it wasn't there previously, but it wasn't explicitly there previously, and that's the intention for making it explicit within this policy.
Two more questions. I noticed in there, I can't remember which page it was on, but it was about places of worship coming under the non-resident development. What are they currently under?
Thank you. Through you, Chair, I'm just checking with the person that administers the policy itself. So it's currently under non-residential, but it wasn't specifically addressed within the policy. Again, it's something that in the last 3 years as a learning of the policy, we've had such examples of that. So the reason it's been introduced is just to align it with best practice, so there is an ambiguity within the policy. It means if someone's to apply, they're quite clear the distinction of which category they sit under. At the moment, it's a officer interpretation of that. So we just wanted to make it clear and explicit within the policy which one they would be assessed and charged under.
Okay, cool. And last one is really just a point of clarification. It's point number 13, which talks about councils expecting $3 million from development contributions, of which $670K is forecasted to be recognised as revenue. Can you clarify why the $3 million isn't revenue?
Of course.
All the sort of the difference there?
Through you, Chair. So it's actually more an accounting practice than anything. So because our DC policy is 30 years long, and in some ways it actually does have historic projects in there as well, it's effectively a revenue recognition policy. We will collect DCs for projects over a 30-year period, but some of those projects some of them aren't started to year 29. So what we actually need to do is we need to build up reserves for those projects. So when we take in a group of DCs, we split it into individual projects and we build up the reserves over time. So the revenue recognition portion of that, the 670, relates to projects that have either been completed or underway, i.e. those DCs should be directly attributed to the project that's there. The balance of that one, for instance, 2.33 million, that will be held and reserved to a point in time to the respective projects are underway. So it's an underlying revenue recognition accounting policy. The idea is you should build up reserves. What in some ways has happened historically is that you would get the money in, you would recognise it, and rates would be offset. But it meant that in the future, when that project needed to be undertaken, the DCs weren't there for that. So it's gone through. This has been a big development in DCs nationally last couple of years.
Thanks.
Just checking, Councillor Duncan, do you have further questions, or is your hand from before?
Yeah, no, just one more question.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
I'm curious as to why we're waiting till halfway through consultation to talk with building and development people.
Through you, Chair. It's a fair question. So the development community is aware that this review is underway because we've let them know for about the last year it was on the way. The reason it is in the third week of that is the economic development team has been running a series of get-togethers called Te Hoi, where we actually engage with the community, have different speakers come in. So rather than having a let's call it a less engaged, different meeting, we've chosen to actually align it with that, and the development community should be there underway as well. So it's an alignment thing. That's why it's in the third week, because that's when the date was proposed.
All right,
Thanks a lot.
not appear to be any further questions, comments. Councillor Philo?
Sorry, yeah, just one more. So with the retirement village, and then I saw also, so that's 0.5 of the development contribution, and then I also saw that there was one for 0.4 for elderly living as well. Can you please just clarify the difference?
Yeah, I definitely can. So one is a house, or so you can have a separated house itself, which is the 0.5. The 0.4 is supported aged care living, i.e. you're living in a hospital. Well, it may not be the correct term because it's not the industry that I'm in, but you're living in a room itself where you have supporting services for different means. So that's the differentiation. And this was the reason there are those tours in our last policy review in 2021. It was a consultation item, and the retirement village community was able to provide data to us, which showed the explicit difference between those two things. So that's why there is two different factors.
So that I understand you correctly, so the retirement homes that have their own standalone properties, like at the landing, and then they've got that larger building that has maybe apartments or rooms within it, that's the rooms within it are the 0.4, is that right?
That's my simple understanding. It's assisted living for those that need further care other than just living in a household themselves. That's my general understanding of it.
Thank you.
Alrighty. No further questions or comments. Just before I put the motion, noting that all three of those options are going to consultation, we are noting option 3 as our preferred option, which includes the brownfield reserves and Komasua housing, and we're including in here delegation to the Chief Executive to make minor editorial changes so the issues that have been picked up can be addressed. So with that, I will put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That is carried. That brings us to the end of business for Te Puna Kōrero. I will note that we will do a karakia at the end of our workshop, so I will close the meeting at 8:51.